Module 3 Review, Classroom Management Strategies. In this review, I will be discussing the strategies that I use to manage my students from this module. First up, we have timeout, exclusion, and isolation. I didn't have to use timeout often, but it was definitely a part of my management plan. Most of the time, if I had a rare student who would act out for whatever reason and disrupt learning, I would send them to another teacher for the remainder of the class period to complete their assignment. As a team, we would have already discussed sending students to each other for time out at the beginning of the school year. They just needed a pass and work to do in the other room. I also had a desk in my room that was isolated from the rest of the desk for students to sit in if they needed to be pulled away from the main group. Attention grabbers. I'm a very noise sensitive person. Therefore, I prefer a room that's quiet. However, on rare occasions, noise levels would rise during class and I would have to calm them down. My first option was to do a countdown. Slowly counting backwards from 5 usually did the trick to regain their attention. If they were really loud and my voice couldn't be heard, I would break out the whistle. Usually, I would let out one long blow and that would stop them in their tracks. How I manage group work. Being a science teacher required a lot of group activities. Therefore, I had to have a set of rules and procedures in place in order to manage them as they worked. Students would be taught how to move to their groups, lab safety, and my expectations at the beginning of the school year. The day of the activity, I would review the directions for the activity, the rules for doing group work, and answer any questions. If a demo was required, I would do that as well. Additionally, I would discuss the lab safety rules and procedures before I would call them to their groups. Students would usually have to produce a product by the end of the activity. This usually kept them focused from start to finish. I also walked around the room to monitor the activity. I always used a timer and would let them know how much time they had left during the activity. Most of the time, I would use the online digital timer that was displayed on screen. When the timer ran out, the alarm would be loud enough for all groups to hear thanks to my loudspeakers. By the end of the activity, students would take a seat and we would review the results as a class. They were required to turn in their lab reports before they left for their next class period. Remember, when doing group work, that repetition and consistency is key. It will become second nature to your students if you have the same requirements each and every time they perform an activity. How I manage students with special needs. I had many special needs students over the years. My classes that included students with special needs ran smoothly for the most part. From time to time, there would be an issue, but usually they were easily handled. Here are the management strategies that worked in my room with my students with special needs. First, I would read their IEP and their accommodations to make sure I knew what they needed in order to learn and how to manage their behavior. Second, I maintain an organized classroom and limited distractions. Third, my routine was the same each and every day from the time they walked in the door till the time they were dismissed. And fourth, I kept my lessons simple for all students. I always tried to break down lessons and directions into smaller, more manageable pieces for students to understand. How I dealt with difficult students. When it came to dealing with the occasional difficult student, I pretty much stuck to my classroom management plan. Using my plan really did the trick with the majority of my students. I rarely had to write up students or send them to the office. If I had to send them to the office, it would usually be for fighting or blatant disrespect. Classroom timers. I use timers all of the time. Timers were my best friends in the classroom. They kept my classes running smoothly. I either used a clock on the wall, a physical timer, or a digital timer. It didn't matter as long as I was able to keep track of the time. I timed everything from the moment class started with the warm-up to the time they were dismissed. I even timed how long it took for them to pass up their papers. Timers were a great way for me to keep on track and keep the class moving without missing a beat. Noise reduction. The only noise I encountered would be during class transitions from other teams and from the field when students were outside for physical education. Therefore, I only needed to shut my door or close my windows to reduce the extra noise or distraction. Here are a few additional tips that I used in my classroom. Walking the classroom was an easy and effective way for me to manage my students. It kept them on their toes if they knew I would be making my rounds and viewing their progress. If I had a problem with a student or two that was chatty or causing disruptions, I would change a few seats to see if that made a difference. It usually did the trick if I found the right seat for the student's relocation. And finally, I used collective punishment when I had a class that was collectively chatty. I would first issue a warning and explain the consequence if the noise continued. If the noise didn't stop after the warning, I would issue the collective punishment. Once students realized they were responsible for each other as a group and would suffer the consequences together, it proved to be really effective with getting them back on track and stopping future chatting. This is the end of the review for Module 3. I hope my responses gave you some insight about how to incorporate some of these strategies into your classroom management routine. See you in Module 4.